The autumn wind cut through Cedar Falls Cemetery like a blade, sending golden maple leaves swirling around the mahogany casket that held my Martha. I stood there in my best black suit, the one she'd pressed for me just 3 weeks ago, clutching her pearl rosary so tight the beads left marks on my weathered palm. 45 years of marriage, and I still expected to hear her voice telling me to stand up straighter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's when I heard Jessica's whisper, sharp as broken glass, cutting through the minister's prayer. Finally free, she breathed to her friend Monica, who'd driven up from Milwaukee for the service. My daughter stood there in designer heels that clicked against the cemetery stones, her black dress more suitable for a cocktail party than laying her mother to rest. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my face steady, my 72-year-old hand steady on that rosary. She thought I couldn't hear her over the minister's words about eternal peace and heavenly rest. But these old ears still work just fine, especially when the words cut deep enough to draw blood from a grieving heart. The October sky hung heavy over Cedar Falls, Wisconsin, painting everything in shades of gray that matched the ache in my chest. I'd been Harold Mitchell for 72 years, but today I felt ancient, standing at the graveside of the woman who'd been my anchor since we were both 18 years old. The Pinewood Cemetery sprawled across rolling hills dotted with oak trees that Martha used to love, their branches now bare and reaching toward storm clouds like skeletal fingers. Martha's casket gleamed under the pale light, surrounded by wreaths of white lilies and yellow roses, her favorite flowers from the garden we'd tended together behind our craftsman house on Maple Street. The funeral director had done a respectable job, considering what we'd had to work with after the stroke took her so suddenly. 3 weeks ago, she'd been watering those roses, humming an old Patsy Cline song while I watched from the kitchen window. Now she was gone, and I was left holding the pieces of a life we'd built together. The crowd gathered around the grave was smaller than I'd expected for a woman who touched so many lives in our little town. Martha had volunteered at the church for 30 years, helped countless families through hard times, and never missed a school fundraiser or community event. But November funerals in Wisconsin don't draw the same crowds as spring celebrations, and many of her friends were getting too old or too frail to stand in the bitter wind. I recognized most of the faces. There was Pastor Williams from First Methodist, his white hair whipping in the breeze as he read from Psalms. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop stood with her husband near the back, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The Kowalski family, whose hardware store had competed with mine for decades, but who'd become dear friends anyway, huddled together under a black umbrella. And then there was Jessica, my only child, stood 20 feet away from me, close enough to show respect, but far enough to avoid having to comfort her grieving father. At 35, she'd inherited Martha's dark hair and green eyes, but none of her mother's warmth or compassion. The black designer dress she wore probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month, and her heels were completely impractical for standing on cemetery grass still soft from last week's rain. Monica Chen stood beside her, Jessica's college roommate who'd driven up from Milwaukee, where she worked at some marketing firm. I'd always liked Monica better than most of Jessica's friends. She at least had the decency to look genuinely sad, her face drawn with grief as she listened to the minister's words about resurrection and eternal life. But Jessica's expression was different. While the rest of us mourned, she wore the look of someone enduring an inconvenience, checking her phone every few minutes and shifting her weight from foot to foot. Her makeup was perfect, not a tear streak in sight, as she kept glancing at her expensive watch as if she had somewhere more important to be. The minister's voice droned on about Martha's devotion to family and community, how she'd been a loving wife and mother, a pillar of the church, and a friend to all who knew her. Every word was true, but they felt hollow against the October wind. Martha had been all those things and more. She'd been my partner in everything, from running the Mitchell family hardware store for 30 years to raising Jessica when she was small and sweet and still called me daddy. That little girl seemed like a stranger now, standing there in her funeral outfit that screamed money and status. When had she become this person who looked at her mother's death as liberation? When had the child who used to help Martha bake cookies for church bake sales turned into someone who whispered, "Finally free," at a graveside service? The answer came to me as Pastor Williams closed his Bible and began the final prayer. It had been gradual, starting in high school when Jessica decided she was too sophisticated for small-town life. College had made it worse, filling her head with ideas about how backwards and limiting Cedar Falls was. The business degree from UW-Madison, the job in Chicago, the expensive apartment, the designer clothes, and it had all been steps away from us, away from the values Martha and I had tried to instill. Martha had seen it happening and tried to bridge the gap. She'd driven to Chicago for visits, sent care packages, called every week, even when Jessica was too busy to call back. She defended our daughter when I complained about the infrequent visits and the obvious discomfort Jessica showed whenever she came home. "She'll come around, Harry," Martha would say, her green eyes still holding hope even as Jessica's visits became shorter and her criticism of our simple life became sharper. "She's just finding her way." But Martha's way of finding peace with everyone had always been stronger than my ability to hold grudges. While I fumed about Jessica's attitude and her increasing demands for money, Martha kept believing in the daughter she'd raised, that little girl who'd once sat on her lap listening to bedtime stories. The prayers ended, and people began to drift away from the graveside, offering their condolences in hushed voices that barely carried over the wind. I accepted their sympathy with nods and handshakes, my throat too tight to manage more than a whispered thank you. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my arm and promised to bring a casserole by the house. The Kowalskis offered to help with anything I might need, their eyes warm with genuine concern. Jessica approached finally, Monica trailing behind her, looking uncomfortable. My daughter's heels clicked on the walkway as she came closer, her purse clutched tight against her side like armor. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound appropriately somber. "It was a lovely service. Mom would have appreciated it." I looked at her, this stranger wearing my daughter's face, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "Would she?" I asked, my voice rougher than I'd intended. "I'm not sure your mother would have appreciated much of what happened today." Jessica's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of irritation that crossed her features. "What's that supposed to mean?" But I was already turning away, walking back toward the black sedan that would take me home to an empty house on Maple Street. Behind me, I heard Monica murmur something to Jessica, probably trying to smooth over the awkwardness. I didn't look back. The car ride home passed in a blur of familiar streets and autumn landscapes. Cedar Falls looked the same as always, with its neat houses and well-maintained yards, the main street lined with local businesses that had weathered decades of economic ups and downs. The Mitchell family hardware store sat empty now, its windows dark since I'd closed it 6 months ago when Martha's health started failing. The for sale sign in the window seemed to mock me as we drove past. My house on Maple Street looked smaller than usual when the funeral director's sedan pulled into the driveway. The white Craftsman, with its wraparound porch and green shutters, had been our pride and joy for 40 years, the place where we'd raised Jessica and built our life together. Now it felt like a museum, full of memories, but empty of the laughter and love that had once filled its rooms. I thanked the driver and walked slowly up the front steps, my arthritic knees protesting the climb. The front door opened with the familiar squeak Martha had been asking me to fix for months. Inside, the house smelled like the lilies from the funeral home, their sweet scent overwhelming in the closed-up rooms.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I sat down heavily in my recliner, the worn brown leather cracked from years of use, and looked around the living room that suddenly felt enormous. Martha's reading chair sat empty beside mine, her bookmark still marking her place in the romance novel she'd been reading before the stroke. Her knitting basket rested on the floor beside it, a half-finished scarf in blue and green yarn spilling over the sides. The silence was deafening. For 45 years, this house had been filled with Martha's presence, her humming in the kitchen as she cooked dinner, her laughter during our evening TV shows, her gentle breathing beside me in bed every night. Now, there was nothing but the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the whisper of wind through the maple trees outside. I closed my eyes and let myself remember Jessica as she used to be. The toddler who followed me around the hardware store asking endless questions about screws and nails and power tools. The little girl who helped Martha plant flowers every spring, her small hands dirty with soil as she carefully placed each bulb in the ground. The teenager who still came to us with her problems, still trusted us to help her navigate the complications of growing up. When had that trust turned to resentment? When had our love become something she wanted to escape? The questions hurt too much to pursue, so I pushed them away and focused on more practical matters. There would be thank you notes to write for the flowers and food that would start arriving tomorrow, bills to pay and arrangements to make, the house to clean and organize, though Martha had kept everything so neat that there wasn't much to do. And then there was Jessica's inheritance to consider. The morning after Martha's funeral, I woke to the sound of rain against my bedroom window and the crushing realization that the empty space beside me wasn't temporary. The pillow still held the faint scent of her lavender shampoo, and for a moment I forgot she was gone. Then reality crashed down like a sledgehammer to the chest. I shuffled to the kitchen in my old blue robe, the hardwood floors cold against my bare feet. The coffee maker sat silent on the counter, and I realized Martha had always been the one to start it before I got up. 45 years of marriage, and I'd never learned her morning routine because she'd never let me. "You work hard enough, Harry," she'd always said. "Let me take care of the little things." Those little things felt enormous now. As I fumbled with the coffee grounds, my mind drifted back to how everything had started to unravel between Jessica and us. It hadn't been sudden, like Martha's stroke. It had been gradual, like rust eating away at metal. So slow you don't notice until the damage is irreversible. Jessica was 7 when I bought the hardware store from old Mr. Peterson. The Mitchell family hardware had been my dream since I was young. A place where neighbors could find everything they needed and get honest advice about their projects. Martha had supported the idea completely, even though it meant using our savings and taking out a loan that scared us both. Those early years had been hard, but good. Jessica would come to the store after school, doing her homework at the counter while Martha and I helped customers. She knew every aisle, every product, and she loved explaining to visitors how her daddy's store was the heart of Cedar Falls. Saturday mornings, she'd help me unload deliveries, her small hands carefully stacking washers and bolts into their proper bins. "Someday this'll all be yours, sweetheart," I'd tell her, and she'd beam with pride, saying she wanted to run the biggest hardware store in Wisconsin. High school changed everything. Jessica discovered that owning a small-town hardware store wasn't glamorous. Her friends had parents who were doctors and lawyers, people with college degrees and clean fingernails. Suddenly, the store embarrassed her. She stopped coming by after school, claiming she had too much homework or too many activities. Martha noticed first, the way mothers always do. "She's growing up, Harry," she'd say when I complained about Jessica's attitude. "Teenagers pull away, it's natural." But this felt different. Jessica wasn't just pulling away from us, she was pulling away from everything we represented. Cedar Falls became boring. Our house became old-fashioned. The store became something she mentioned reluctantly, if at all, when college friends asked about her family. The real blow came during her sophomore year at UW-Madison. She'd called home, her voice bright with excitement, about an internship opportunity in Chicago. A marketing firm wanted her for the summer, but it was unpaid, and she'd need money for an apartment and living expenses. "How much do you need, sweetheart?" Martha had asked, already reaching for the checkbook. "About $8,000, Jessica had said, as casually as if she were asking for lunch money. I'd nearly choked on my coffee. $8,000 was more than we'd made in profit some months at the store. But Martha was already writing the check, her face glowing with pride in our daughter's opportunities. "We'll figure it out," she'd whispered to me later that night. This could change her whole life. So we'd given Jessica the money, taking out a line of credit against the store to cover it. She'd spent that summer in Chicago, calling home less and less frequently, her voice growing more distant each time. When she came back for Christmas, she seemed like a different person, talking about networking and career trajectories and how small-town thinking held people back. The pattern continued through college and into her first job. Every year brought new requests for money, each one larger than the last. Graduate school applications required fees. Professional wardrobes needed updating. Car payments couldn't be made on an entry-level salary. Each time, Martha would find a way to help, even when it meant sacrificing things we'd planned for ourselves. The vacation to Alaska we'd dreamed about got postponed when Jessica needed help with a security deposit on a better apartment. The new roof we'd been saving for got delayed when she asked us to co-sign a loan for a newer car. Martha's medical bills started piling up, but we kept sending Jessica money because Martha couldn't bear the thought of our daughter struggling. "She's building her future," Martha would say whenever I questioned the endless financial requests. "We invested in the store for years before it paid off. This is the same thing." But it wasn't the same thing, and deep down, I think Martha knew it. The store had been something we'd built together, something that gave back to the community and supported our family. Jessica's career seemed to exist only to distance herself from everything we valued. The visits home became shorter and more infrequent. Jessica would arrive on Friday evening and leave Sunday morning, spending most of her time on her phone or laptop working on projects that were apparently too important to set aside for family time. She'd critique everything about our house, our town, our way of life, always with the suggestion that we should want more, be more, aspire to something beyond Cedar Falls. "You could sell the store and the house," she'd said during one particularly painful visit. "Move to a nice retirement community in Florida. Stop working so hard."
Martha had gone quiet at that suggestion, her hands still in the dishwater where she'd been washing our Sunday dinner plates. I'd seen her shoulders tense, but she hadn't said anything. Later that night, after Jessica had gone to bed, Martha had cried for the first time in years. "She doesn't understand," she'd whispered against my shoulder. "This isn't just a business and a house. This is our life. These are our roots." I'd held her close, feeling her tears soak through my shirt, and promised myself I'd try harder to bridge the gap between us and Jessica. But every conversation seemed to make things worse. Jessica saw our contentment with small-town life as a lack of ambition. We saw her constant pursuit of more money and status as a betrayal of the values we'd tried to teach her. The worst fight had come 3 years ago, during Christmas dinner. Jessica had been complaining about her job, her boss, her apartment, her expenses, building up to another request for money. This time it was $10,000 to help with a down payment on a condo. "Jessica," I'd said, setting down my fork, "we can't keep doing this. The store is barely profitable anymore, and your mother's medical bills are getting expensive." She'd stared at me like I'd slapped her. "Medical bills? What medical bills?" Martha had tried to smooth things over, explaining about her arthritis medication and the physical therapy she'd been getting for her back problems. Nothing serious, she'd insisted, just the normal aches and pains of getting older. But Jessica hadn't been listening to the medical details. She'd been calculating. "How much are we talking about?" she'd asked, her voice sharp. "It's not important," Martha had said quickly. "We're managing fine." "No, I want to know. How much are you spending on this stuff every month?" When Martha reluctantly admitted the amount, Jessica's face had gone pale, then red with anger. "That's insane. You're throwing money away on treatments that probably don't even work. Have you looked into Medicare Advantage plans? There are ways to minimize these costs." "We're not throwing money away," I'd said, my own temper rising. "We're taking care of your mother's health. By paying full price for everything instead of shopping around? Dad, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You make decisions based on emotion instead of logic. You could save thousands of dollars a year if you just put some thought into it." The fight had escalated from there, with Jessica lecturing us about financial responsibility while asking us to fund her lifestyle. The irony was lost on her, but it wasn't lost on me. By the time she'd stormed out to her rental car, throwing her suitcase in the trunk and peeling out of our driveway, I'd been shaking with rage. Martha had spent the rest of that Christmas crying, blaming herself for the fight, wondering what she'd done wrong as a mother. It had taken weeks for her to stop asking if we should call Jessica and apologize. We didn't hear from our daughter for 6 months after that fight. No calls, no emails, no acknowledgement of birthdays or holidays. When she finally did reach out, it was through a text message asking if we'd reconsider helping with the condo down payment. No apology, no explanation, just another request for money. Martha had wanted to send it to her. "Maybe this will help her settle down," she'd said. "Maybe owning something will help her understand what we've built here." But I'd refused. For the first time in our marriage, I'd put my foot down about Jessica, and it had broken Martha's heart. She'd spent the next year making excuses for our daughter's silence, insisting that Jessica was just busy with her career, that she'd come around when she was ready. The stroke had changed everything. Martha had collapsed in our garden on a Tuesday morning in October, her body shutting down as suddenly as a power outage. I found her 20 minutes later, unconscious among the rose bushes she'd been pruning. The paramedics had said it was a miracle I'd found her so quickly, that every minute mattered with strokes. But even finding her quickly hadn't been enough. The damage was extensive, affecting her speech and movement on her left side. The doctors had been optimistic at first, talking about rehabilitation and recovery. But Martha had known better. She'd always been sharp about people and situations, and she was sharp about her own condition, too. "I won't be a burden," she'd said during one of our last real conversations, her words slurred but determined. "Promise me, you won't let me become a burden." I'd promised, even though the words felt like swallowing glass. Martha had lived for 3 more weeks, fading a little each day until her body finally gave up the fight. I'd been holding her hand when she died, talking to her about the garden and the store and how much I loved her, hoping she could still hear me. Jessica had come for the funeral, arriving the night before and staying at a hotel downtown instead of in her childhood bedroom. She'd been polite but distant, treating Martha's death like an unfortunate business interruption rather than the loss of her mother. The black designer dress, the expensive shoes, the way she checked her phone during the service, it all spoke to a woman who'd learned to value the wrong things. And then those words at the graveside, "Finally free," as if Martha's love and care had been a prison instead of a gift. As if the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her daughter's happiness had been holding Jessica back instead of lifting her up. I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, where Martha and I had shared thousands of breakfasts, looking out at the garden she'd tended with such care. The roses were dormant now, their stems bare and thorny, but they'd bloom again in the spring. Martha had always said that gardens required patience, that you had to trust in the cycle of seasons and believe that beauty would return after the harsh winter. Maybe she'd been trying to teach me something about Jessica, too. Maybe she'd believed that our daughter would eventually return to the values we'd raised her with, that the coldness and greed were just a winter phase that would pass. But sitting in that empty kitchen, staring at the chair where Martha would never sit again, I couldn't find that kind of hope. Jessica had made her choice,
when she'd whispered those cruel words over her mother's grave. She'd revealed who she really was, and it wasn't the daughter we'd raised. It was someone I no longer recognized, someone who saw Martha's death as liberation instead of loss, someone who had no idea what was coming next. 3 days after the funeral, I found myself standing in Martha's sewing room, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in my hand. The afternoon light filtered through sheer curtains, casting everything in a golden glow that made the dust motes dance like tiny spirits. Martha had kept this room meticulously organized, with fabric sorted by color and pattern, buttons arranged in mason jars by size, and her grandmother's Singer sewing machine positioned perfectly by the window. I'd avoided this room since she died, knowing it would hurt too much. But something had drawn me here today, a feeling I couldn't quite name. As I stood among her things, breathing in the faint scent of fabric softener and her favorite vanilla candle, I felt closer to her than I had since the stroke. That's when I saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of quilting magazines on her desk was a manila folder I'd never noticed before. My name was written across the front in Martha's careful handwriting, the letters slightly shakier than usual, probably written during her final weeks when her hands weren't as steady. Inside the folder, I found documents that changed everything. The first was a letter addressed to me, sealed in an envelope marked "For Harry's Eyes Only." My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing Martha's voice in every carefully chosen word. "My dearest Harry," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably hurting more than you know how to handle. I know you, my stubborn, wonderful man. You're probably sitting in my sewing room with that lost look you get when you can't fix something with your hands." I had to stop reading for a moment, her words so perfectly capturing how I felt that it was like having her in the room with me. "I need you to know that I've been preparing for this day longer than you might think. The stroke wasn't my first warning, Harry. Dr. Chen and I have been monitoring some heart irregularities for months, and we both knew my time might be limited. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to spend our last months worrying instead of living." My throat tightened as I read on. Martha had known she was dying and had kept it from me to protect me from pain. Even in her final months, she'd been taking care of everyone else. I've been watching Jessica these past few years, and I've seen what you've seen. Our daughter has lost her way, Harry. The values we tried to teach her, the love we poured into her, it's all been overshadowed by her pursuit of things that don't matter. I kept hoping she'd find her way back to us, but I realize now that she needs a stronger lesson. The letter went on to explain that Martha had been quietly working with Bob Coleman, our family attorney, to make some changes. She'd researched Jessica's lifestyle, her spending habits, her treatment of others, and had come to a painful conclusion about the kind of person our daughter had become. "She thinks my death will solve her problems, Harry. She's counting on an inheritance that will fund her selfishness for years to come, but I've made other arrangements. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank, and Bob has the other key. Inside, you'll find everything you need to teach Jessica what real value looks like." I set the letter aside with shaking hands and examined the other documents in the folder. There were bank statements showing accounts I'd never known about, investment records dating back decades, and receipts for transactions that painted a picture of a woman who'd been far more financially savvy than she'd ever let on. Martha had been secretly setting money aside for years, small amounts from her part-time job at the church office, careful investments made with money she'd saved from household expenses, even profits from selling her quilts at craft fairs that I'd assumed went back into fabric and supplies. She'd built a substantial nest egg without ever touching our joint accounts or the money from the hardware store. But the most shocking document was a copy of her revised will, dated just 2 months before her death. According to this version, Jessica's inheritance would be far different from what she was expecting. Instead of the house,
the remaining business assets, and Martha's personal belongings, our daughter would receive exactly $1 and a letter explaining why. Everything else was being left to the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, specifically earmarked for a scholarship fund for local students who demonstrated both academic merit and strong character. The kind of young people who reminded Martha of what Jessica used to be, before greed and status became her priorities. I sank into Martha's desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what she'd planned. My quiet, gentle wife had orchestrated a lesson in humility that would strip away everything Jessica thought she deserved. But there was more. The folder contained detailed notes about Jessica's financial situation, information that Martha had gathered during their phone conversations and visits. Our daughter was living far beyond her means, counting on our deaths to solve her money problems. She'd taken out loans against her expected inheritance, made commitments based on money she didn't yet have, and built a lifestyle that was entirely dependent on our assets. Martha had even included printouts of Jessica's social media posts, screenshots that showed our daughter flaunting expensive purchases and lavish vacations while simultaneously complaining about her financial stress. The disconnect between her public image and her private desperation was stark, and Martha had documented every contradiction. But perhaps the most damning evidence was a recorded phone conversation from 3 months ago. Martha had started recording their calls after Jessica's behavior became increasingly demanding and disrespectful.
The voice recorder, a small digital device I'd bought her for dictating quilting patterns, had captured Jessica's true feelings about us with brutal clarity. I pressed play on the device, hearing Martha's voice answer cheerfully. "Hello, sweetheart." "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." Jessica's voice came through the speaker, tense and impatient. "I've been thinking about your situation there, and I really think you and Dad need to start making some practical decisions about the future." "What kind of decisions, honey?" "Well, you're both getting older, and that house is way too big for 2 people. Plus, Dad's hardware store isn't exactly a gold mine, is it? You could sell everything, move into a nice assisted living facility, and have money left over for your medical bills and expenses." Martha's voice remained calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath. "We love our home, Jessica, and your father isn't ready to retire yet. Mom, be realistic. How much longer can Dad keep running that store? And what happens when one of you has a serious health issue? You'll burn through your savings in no time, and then what? You'll expect me to take care of everything?" The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Jessica pressing harder and harder for us to liquidate our assets. She painted a picture of inevitable decline and financial ruin, arguing that we were being selfish by holding on to our property and business instead of converting everything to cash that could be properly managed. What chilled me most was her casual assumption that we'd become a burden to her, and her obvious calculation of how our deaths would solve problems she'd created for herself. She never once asked about our happiness or well-being. Every concern she raised was ultimately about protecting her inheritance from potential medical expenses or long-term care costs. "I love you both," she had said at the end of the call, "but I need you to start thinking about this stuff. I can't be responsible for cleaning up a mess if you don't plan properly." The recording ended, and I sat in silence, staring at the device that had captured my daughter's true nature. Martha had listened to this conversation and realized that Jessica saw us not as parents to be cherished, but as assets to be managed and ultimately liquidated for her benefit. The final item in the folder was a business card for a private investigator in Milwaukee, with a note in Martha's handwriting. "Tom Morrison has been very helpful. He has more information when you're ready." I stared at the card, wondering what else Martha had discovered about Jessica's life. What other secrets had she uncovered while quietly preparing for this moment? My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Bob Coleman's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a voice that sounded stronger than I felt. "Harry, how are you holding up?" His concern was genuine, the warmth of a friendship that went back 30 years. "I'm managing, Bob. Actually, I just found something interesting in Martha's sewing room. There was a pause before he responded. Ah, she said you'd find it when you were ready. Are you ready to talk about what comes next? I looked around Martha's sewing room, at the evidence of a life lived with purpose and love, at the documents that revealed how carefully she'd planned this final lesson for our daughter. Yes, I said firmly. I think I am. Good. Can you meet me at the office tomorrow morning? There are some things we need to discuss before Jessica starts asking questions about the will. I agreed to the meeting and hung up, then sat quietly among Martha's things as the afternoon light faded. She'd given me a roadmap for justice, a way to honor her memory while teaching Jessica what she should have learned years ago. The girl who'd once helped me stack bolts and washers had grown into a woman who saw love as weakness and generosity as foolishness. But Martha had seen through Jessica's facade and prepared accordingly. My wife had always been the wiser one in our marriage, the one who understood people's hearts even when they tried to hide their true nature. She'd spent her final months not just preparing for her own death, but orchestrating a reckoning that would force Jessica to confront what she'd become. I picked up the private investigator's business card and dialed his number. When Tom Morrison answered, his voice was professional but kind. "Mr. Mitchell? I've been expecting your call. Martha spoke of you often. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I understand you have information about my daughter." "Quite a bit, actually. Your wife was very specific about what she wanted me to find," Tom said, opening the first folder. She suspected Jessica was in deeper financial trouble than she was letting on, and, unfortunately, she was right. The documents he showed me painted a picture of someone living a complete lie. Jessica's luxury apartment in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood cost $4,000 a month, nearly twice what she made at her marketing job. Her credit card debt had ballooned to over $60,000 across 8 different cards, most of them nearly maxed out. She'd taken cash advances to pay minimum balances on other cards, creating a house of cards that would collapse the moment her income disappeared. But the real shock was the loan she'd taken against her expected inheritance. Jessica had somehow convinced a private lending company to give her a $150,000 loan using our family assets as collateral. The interest rate was astronomical, nearly 20%, and the balloon payment would come due just 6 months after Martha's death. "How is this even legal?" I asked, staring at the loan documents. Tom shrugged grimly. "It's a gray area. These companies specialize in inheritance loans. They bet that grieving families won't scrutinize the paperwork too closely. Jessica told them she was the sole heir to substantial assets, and they didn't dig too deep into the details." I felt sick imagining Jessica calculating the value of our deaths, turning our family home and Martha's possessions into collateral for her spending spree. The woman I'd raised had become someone who could look at her parents and see dollar signs instead of people who loved her. "There's more," Tom continued, opening another folder. "Your daughter's been telling people some interesting stories about her family situation." He showed me printouts of social media posts and screenshots of conversations Jessica had shared with friends. In her version of reality, she was a successful businesswoman being held back by backward parents who refused to embrace modern financial planning. She portrayed Martha and me as stubborn elderly people clinging to outdated values, sitting on valuable assets while refusing to enjoy our golden years properly. One particularly painful post showed a photo of our house taken from the street, with Jessica's caption reading, "Still trying to convince the parents to downsize from this money pit. Some people just can't accept that change is good." The comments from her friends were worse. They encouraged her to stage an intervention and suggested that elderly people often needed their children to make difficult decisions for them. Jessica had liked and responded to these comments, treating our autonomy as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a right to be respected. "She's been building a narrative," Tom explained, making herself look like the responsible daughter dealing with difficult parents. It gives her cover for what she's planning to do with the inheritance. What Jessica was planning, according to Tom's investigation, was to sell everything as quickly as possible. She'd already contacted real estate agents about the house's value and had gotten appraisals on Martha's antique jewelry. She'd researched estate sale companies and had preliminary conversations about liquidating our possessions. All of this while Martha was still alive, while we were still grieving and vulnerable. The most damning evidence was a recorded phone conversation Tom had obtained through Jessica's cell phone records. She'd been talking to her friend Monica, the same woman who'd attended the funeral, discussing her inheritance plans with casual cruelty. The funeral was such a drag, Jessica's voice came through Tom's digital recorder. But at least it's finally over. Mom was holding onto that house and all her stuff like some kind of hoarder. Now I can finally get everything converted to cash and invested properly. Monica's voice was harder to hear, but her response was audible enough. What about your dad? Won't he want to stay in the house? Jessica's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Dad's 72 and completely lost without Mom. He'll be better off in assisted living anyway. Honestly, I'm doing him a favor by taking this burden off his shoulders. The casual way she discussed dismantling our life, as if Martha and I were problems to be solved rather than people to be loved, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just greed talking. This was complete detachment from basic human empathy. Tom had more recordings, conversations where Jessica discussed her financial problems with friends and family members, always framing them as temporary setbacks that would be resolved once she received her inheritance. She'd borrowed money from cousins and college friends, promising to pay them back with interest once the estate was settled. She'd even taken out payday loans at predatory rates, so confident was she that our deaths would solve all her problems. She's borrowed against the inheritance from at least 12 different sources, Tom said, showing me a spreadsheet he'd compiled. When you add up all her deaths and commitments, she needs roughly $300,000 just to break even. The number stunned me. Jessica had somehow managed to spend money she didn't have on a scale that boggled my mind. The house Martha and I had paid off over 30 years, the savings we'd accumulated through decades of careful living, the modest investments we'd made for our retirement, all of it would disappear into the black hole of Jessica's debts if she inherited as she expected. But Martha had made sure that wouldn't happen. Tom's final folder contained documentation of Jessica's lifestyle, photos and receipts that showed where all the borrowed money had gone. Designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary, vacations to Europe and the Caribbean that she'd funded with credit cards, a BMW lease that consumed nearly a third of her income, restaurant bills that exceeded what Martha and I spent on groceries in a month. She'd been living like a millionaire while borrowing against our deaths, treating our love and sacrifice as nothing more than a delayed payment plan for her fantasies.
Your wife knew all of this when she revised her will, Tom said quietly. She wanted you to understand the scope of what Jessica had become before you had to face her directly. The next phase of Martha's plan required me to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. Jessica needed to believe that her inheritance was secure, that her financial salvation was just a matter of paperwork and probate. Only when she was completely committed to her fantasy would the truth be revealed. Bob Coleman had scheduled the formal reading of Martha's will for the following week, sending Jessica an official notice that brought her rushing back to Cedar Falls for the first time since the funeral. She'd called me the night before her arrival, her voice bright with barely concealed excitement. "Dad, I know this is hard for you, but we need to talk about practical things," she'd said. "The will reading is just a formality, but there are going to be decisions to make about the house and Mom's things. I've been doing some research about estate sales and property values, and I think we can maximize everything if we move quickly." I'd listened to her talk about maximizing our assets as if Martha's possessions were commodities to be traded, biting my tongue to keep from revealing what I knew. Jessica had no idea that every word she spoke was being recorded, that every assumption she made about her inheritance was about to be shattered. "I'll be staying at the Holiday Inn downtown," she'd continued. "I've got meetings set up with a real estate agent and an estate sale company for later in the week. We can get the ball rolling while we're waiting for probate to clear." The casualness with which she discussed dismantling our life was breathtaking. She'd planned our family's destruction with the efficiency of a business merger, reducing 45 years of marriage and love to a series of financial transactions. That night, I'd sat in Martha's chair for the first time since her death, holding her letter and feeling her presence guide me toward what needed to happen next. Jessica had made her choices over the years, turning away from everything we'd tried to teach her about love, loyalty, and what really mattered in life. She'd decided that our deaths were opportunities rather than losses, that our assets were more valuable than our affection. Martha had seen this coming and had prepared accordingly. The revised will was just the beginning. There were other surprises waiting, other lessons that would force Jessica to confront what she'd become and what she'd thrown away in her pursuit of material wealth. The snow continued falling outside my window, covering Cedar Falls in pristine white that made everything look peaceful and clean. But beneath that calm surface, the machinery of justice was already in motion. Jessica's reckoning was coming, and she had no idea how completely her world was about to change. Tomorrow she would sit in Bob Coleman's office expecting to claim her inheritance. Instead, she would learn that actions have consequences, that love cannot be taken for granted, and that some lessons can only be taught through loss. Martha had spent her final months preparing this moment, and I would make sure her plan was executed perfectly. Our daughter had forgotten who raised her and what values we'd tried to instill in her. It was time to remind her, whether she wanted to remember or not. The law office of Coleman and Associates had never felt so cold. I sat in the familiar leather chair across from Bob's mahogany desk, the same spot where Martha and I had signed our first will 30 years ago. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, but it couldn't warm the chill that had settled in my bones since Jessica walked through the door 10 minutes earlier. Her black suit was expensive, her makeup perfect, but there was something brittle about her smile as she hugged me and expressed condolences that sounded rehearsed. She'd brought a leather portfolio and kept checking her phone, treating Martha's will reading like a business meeting.
"I know this is difficult, Dad," she said, settling into the chair beside me, "but we need to be practical about Mom's wishes and think about what's best for both of us going forward." Bob cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, the gesture I remembered from decades of friendship. He looked older today, the weight of what he was about to do evident in the lines around his eyes. Martha had been like a sister to him, and carrying out her final wishes was clearly taking a toll. "Before we begin," Bob said formally, "I need to confirm that both parties understand this is the legal reading of Martha Elizabeth Mitchell's last will and testament, executed on September 15th of this year." Jessica nodded eagerly, her pen poised over a legal pad. She had already calculated how quickly the estate could be liquidated, how soon her financial problems would disappear. I could see it in her posture, the barely contained excitement of someone who believed salvation was moments away. Bob opened the folder with deliberate slowness, and I caught Jessica's sharp intake of breath. This was the moment she'd been waiting for since Martha's diagnosis, the culmination of months of planning and preparation for a windfall that would solve all her self-created problems. "To my beloved husband, Harold Mitchell, I leave our family home at 1247 Maple Street, along with all furnishings, personal effects, and household items contained therein." Jessica's pen stopped moving. I watched confusion flicker across her face as she processed words that didn't match her expectations. The house was supposed to be part of her inheritance, not something left solely to me. "I also leave to Harold all remaining business assets from Mitchell Family Hardware, including inventory, equipment, and the commercial property at 45 Main Street." The confusion deepened, and Jessica shifted in her chair. "Wait," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "What about the joint assets, the investments and savings accounts?" Bob continued reading, without acknowledging her question. "To my daughter, Jessica Ann Mitchell, I leave my pearl earrings, my mother's wedding ring, and the sum of $1, along with this letter of explanation. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. Her face went white, then flushed deep red as the reality sunk in. $1. After months of borrowing against her inheritance, after building her entire financial future on the assumption of substantial assets, Martha had left her essentially nothing. "This is impossible," Jessica stammered, her voice rising. "There has to be a mistake. Mom wouldn't. She couldn't." Bob handed her the sealed letter Martha had written specifically for this moment. Jessica's hands shook as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting with growing horror. "My dear Jessica," Martha's voice seemed to echo in the room as Jessica read silently. "If you're reading this, then you've just learned that actions have consequences and love cannot be taken for granted. I know about the loans you've taken against our assets. I know about your plans to sell our home and liquidate our possessions. I know because I've been listening, recording, and documenting your true feelings about your father and me for months." Jessica's face crumpled as she read, tears streaming down her cheeks. The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing every financial deception, every cruel calculation, every moment when Jessica had chosen greed over love. Martha had documented it all with the thoroughness of someone who understood that some lessons could only be learned through complete loss. "The remainder of my estate," Bob continued reading from the will, "including all financial assets, investments, and personal property not specifically bequeathed to Harold, shall be donated to the Cedar Falls Community Foundation to establish the Martha Mitchell Memorial Scholarship Fund." Jessica looked up from the letter, her mascara streaked, her composure completely shattered. "How much?" she whispered. "How much went to the scholarship?"
"Approximately $420,000, Bob replied quietly. The number hit Jessica like a sledgehammer. She'd borrowed almost $300,000 against an inheritance that would have covered her debts with money left over for her future. Instead, she now faced financial ruin with no way out and no family to turn to for help. "You knew," she said, turning to me with eyes full of rage and desperation. "You knew about this and you let me think." "I let you show us who you really are," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Your mother spent her last months watching you plan our destruction, listening to you calculate the value of our deaths. She gave you every chance to remember the daughter we raised, and you chose money over love every single time." Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I'll contest this will. I'll prove Mom wasn't in her right mind when she wrote it." Bob shook his head sadly. "The will is ironclad, Jessica. Your mother had multiple witnesses, medical evaluations confirming her mental competency, and months of documented evidence supporting her decisions. Any challenge would be frivolous and expensive." The reality of her situation finally penetrated Jessica's shock. She was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt with no inheritance to cover it. The loans would come due, the credit cards would demand payment, and the lifestyle she'd built on borrowed money would collapse around her. She looked at me one last time, searching for any sign of the father who'd once given her everything she wanted. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to distinguish between love and enabling, between generosity and foolishness. "Goodbye, Jessica," I said quietly. "When you're ready to remember who you used to be, when you're ready to rebuild your life on something more solid than other people's money, you'll know where to find me." She gathered her things and left without another word, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway as she fled from the consequences of her choices. Through the window, I watched her get into a rental car and drive away, probably heading straight to the airport to escape the wreckage of her plans. Bob and I sat in silence for several minutes after she left. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with sadness. "Martha hoped it wouldn't come to this. She kept believing Jessica might change, might remember what really mattered. Martha was always more optimistic than me, but she was also more practical when it counted.
Jessica needed to learn that love isn't something you can exploit, and people aren't just assets to be managed. I signed the necessary papers to finalize the estate transfer and establish the scholarship fund. Martha's money would help dozens of young people get the education Jessica had received, hopefully with better results. The first recipients would be announced in the spring, when the roses in Martha's garden bloomed again. Walking out of the law office into the crisp December air, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Martha's death: peace. Justice had been served not through revenge or cruelty, but through the natural consequences of Jessica's own choices. She'd gambled everything on inheriting money she hadn't earned, and she'd lost because she'd forgotten that family was about more than financial transactions. 6 months later, I received a letter from Jessica. She'd declared bankruptcy, lost her apartment, and moved back to Wisconsin to take a job as a sales clerk in Eau Claire. The letter was different from anything she'd written before, humble and honest in a way that reminded me of the daughter I'd raised. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know I threw away something precious for things that didn't matter. I'm learning to live differently now, to value what's real instead of what looks impressive. I hope someday I can prove to you that some part of the daughter you and Mom raised is still alive in me. I kept the letter, but didn't respond immediately.
Some lessons take time to fully absorb, and Jessica needed to prove to herself that she could change before seeking forgiveness from others. Martha's scholarship fund was already helping 3 deserving students, and I'd started volunteering at the community center, teaching woodworking to kids who reminded me of what Jessica used to be. The house on Maple Street was quiet, but not empty anymore. It was filled with Martha's memory and the satisfaction of a lesson well taught. My daughter had learned that love cannot be taken for granted, and that some inheritance cannot be claimed, only earned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.